Hey there guys, I just wanted to stop in and check in with you guys and give you just a mini little lecture here that is kind of replacing the lab for the moment. Obviously, with the state of things, it's really hard for us to conduct any type of physiological testing because COVID is spreading like wildfire, and we just aren't getting a chance to get in the lab and to do some of these procedures. So what I would like to do is kind of go over some of these lab procedures that we would use to assess somebody who has atrial fibrillation and prescribe exercise for them. So I'm going to bring in some different tools and some different items here from some different textbooks that I have uploaded to your module. And they should all be there and present for you. And I just want to kind of walk through these things and show you how we would put them all together and utilize them. So let's start with your chapter in your textbook. I will show you what it has and how to use that with the pathophysiology map. And I will introduce some things that it doesn't have because they removed it from previous editions. So let's start there. So here we can see your textbook for the, what edition is that? 4th edition of the textbook. And you should see some terms here that you will also see on your pathophysiology maps. So here we can see the disease, the basic pathophysiology. We can see some of the symptoms here. These are medications. We're not going to focus on medication in this course. More medications here, and then you can see effects on exercise response and effects of exercise training. And then over here you can see recommendations for exercise testing, and you can see recommendations for exercise programming. So your textbook chapters are very short. So I have been providing additional information to kind of help you out in your understanding of this information by giving you some more reading and things of that nature. So one thing I want to show you is, let me pull this up really quick here, your pathophysiology map. You guys should be familiar with this now. We can see disease, pathophysiology, effects of exercise associated with the disease, signs and symptoms, complications, exercise testing, exercise prescription, and other considerations. So let's look at this kind of side by side here. Let's go this here and this here. Okay, and we'll kind of zoom in on this a little bit if we can. Here we go. All right, so we have the disease. We have the disease. We have the basic pathophysiology. We have the basic pathophysiology. We have a couple of symptoms here, right? So signs and symptoms, there you go. And then if we kind of move on here, let me see if I can scroll now because no, I can't scroll. What just happened here? There we go. Whoops. Let me zoom out. Here we can see exercise effects, and I have this here, effects on exercise response, effects on exercise training. So while you read this and while you read this, you should be extracting important bullet points to put here, right? So what you're doing essentially is you're just creating this hard and fast chapter outline that takes all the important information and puts it on a single page for you, right? So I'm teaching you to kind of think critically and to extract information that is important and leave the rest of it alone so that you're not kind of pulling out fluff and just putting it in here. And then we get into exercise testing and exercise prescription. You can see here that we have exercise testing and recommendations for exercise programming. So it's all here for you, right? And then you can put it all in here, and then I'll take these from you guys, give you guys a couple of points for doing that work for me. Again, if it's garbage, I'm not giving you anything. If it looks good and I can tell that you've done some work, I will give you some points. Now, that kind of summarizes what's going on with your textbook and the pathophysiology maps. So I want to look at another thing now. Let me close this out and bring in a picture of something you guys do not have in this textbook, and I wish they would have kept doing it. It's in the 2nd and the 3rd edition, but for some reason they did not put it in this new edition. And I really like this because it really helps kind of clarify things for us. So if we look here, you could see examples for exercise testing, and there's methods. So we can do aerobic testing, we can do endurance testing, and we can do flexibility testing. So we know that with this population, we're dealing with at-risk, and we're very limited to what we can do with at-risk individuals. So we can do a cycle test, and it has some different protocols here for a cycle test, or we could do a treadmill test, and we have some different protocols here for a treadmill test. So what is a Naughton or a bulk test? I'll show you what those are. Now, if we're going to do these types of tests, we have to measure certain things. And one of the things we would measure is we would do a 12 prod or a 12 lead ECG, right? Which you guys should know a lot about now after watching my video on how an ECG works. If we were in the lab, we would actually be showing you guys how to use this and how to read this. We would also be monitoring heart rate. All right. So it's very important if we're dealing with somebody that has atrial fibrillation that we monitor how the heart is contracting and what the heart rate is doing at a sub-maximal level, because obviously these are all going to be sub-maximal tests. The other thing we would want to do is measure blood pressure. We would want to have a rate of perceived exertion scale available. We would want to have an angina scale available. I'll show you what that is momentarily. If we were measuring gas, we would want to do a VO2 gas exchange. We would not do a radionucleotide testing. So that's one thing that we would kind of punt. Now, if we're going to measure these things, we have to know when to end that test because this is becoming dangerous. So we would end this test, we would end this aerobic test if there were any serious dysrhythmias. So we had some rapid changing of heart rate. If there was a 2 millimeter ST segment depression or elevation. So you should know what the ST wave means and what it represents because we just went through what all those waves mean. We would stop if we reached the ischemic threshold. We would stop if there was a T-wave inversion. We would stop if there was systolic blood pressure went beyond 250 or diastolic blood pressure went above 115. So there's all these things that tell us that what we are doing over here is becoming dangerous and we need to stop. All right, so we're going to talk about this for a little bit. And again, this isn't in your new textbook, and I wish they would have kept this because I really like these parameters because it makes us understand the physiology a little more. You can see with the endurance 6-minute walk test, this is a bit easier to do. And we do want to also measure flexibility. This is going to be easy as well. So let's kind of talk about some of these ramp tests and talk about some of these endpoints and make sure we understand exactly what they mean and what they represent. Okay, so let me just align this information for you. So what you see here is information that you should have learned and encountered in 456A when we were teaching you the basic assessment methodologies for exercise science. And what you'll see here is there's different protocols for a treadmill protocol. Now, most of these protocols, you can see here that the Costel and Fox protocol is recommended for highly trained individuals. You see that there. You can see that the Bruce protocol is recommended for normal or high-risk populations. You can see that the Naughton test is recommended for cardiac and high-risk individuals. You can see that the Astrand test is represented for highly trained individuals, but there's also a modified Astrand test. So we have all these different tests here. Here's another one, which is a modified Bruce. A modified Bruce is for normal and high risk. The bulk and wear is for normal risk. And then we have the Cuttis, which is for cardiac and high risk. So within this page here that is in a textbook that you should already have for your 456A course, I'm just kind of showing you the differences between these tests based upon what population that you're working with. Now, ramp protocols, they basically provide us this continuous and frequent work rate that exists with increments, okay? And this basically, when we do this protocol, this would test VO2. And we know that as work or intensity increases, right? So let me see if I can draw here. That'd be fantastic if I can draw, because I love drawing. Here we go. Nope, that's not what I'm looking for. Let me see. Maybe? Let's try it. Nope, that's a highlighter. Here we go. This is what I want. Nope, that's not what I want. Oh, goodness. Here we go. Did that work? Yes. Oh, sweet. Okay. So we know that we have the grade here. We have time here. And we can see that we have these intervals here, right? So this one, every 2 minutes, we have an increase in grade. And that increase in grade, right? 2 minutes, increase in grade. 2 minutes, increase in grade. We're going to have an increase in intensity. And what's going to happen is our heart rate is going to follow that in a linear fashion, right? And then our, can I change colors with this? Is that a possibility? No, cannot. We know that our VO2, let's just say that that's this one, is also going to increase linearly with intensity, right? So that's a known fact. So they are designed to kind of bring individuals to their limit of exercise tolerance in approximately 10 minutes while measuring heart rate and while measuring VO2. So we know that this test is going to have a speed of 8.9 miles per hour, which is pretty high. That makes sense that this is for highly trained individuals, because how many of you guys could run at 8.9 miles per hour with an increase in grade every 2 minutes for at least 10 minutes? That's a pretty intense test. Now let's compare that test to, let's look at the Naughton test down here, okay? So we have a very different test here. This test, we don't even see our first change until 4 minutes. And look at the speed here. The speed here is 2 miles per hour versus 8.9 miles per hour. So it would make sense that this test is going to be designed for people who are at risk. Now, if we look here, one of the tests that they advise us to do is the Naughton test. All right, so we are looking at that test. So this test for people with AFib would be something we would kind of gravitate towards if we were going to do a treadmill test. Now, while on that treadmill, while conducting this test, we're going to look at ECG. So what is ECG? I hate to pull this out, but let's just make sure that we're being thorough here. We know that this is ECG. We're going to be looking at the patterns of contractility. And there's a couple areas that we need to be aware of while doing ECG. And if you look here, we're going to look at that ST segment, right? So we're going to look, can I draw here? Let's see if I can draw here. That'd be kind of cool if I can. Lots of drawing. Here we go. So we're going to be looking at this segment here. And we're going to be looking for any changes in depression or elevation. So let's say the T wave goes up slightly. Or let's say the S wave goes down a bit farther, right? Or let's say the T wave has a depression this way. Okay, so we're looking for any changes in characteristics of the ST complex. And let me get rid of this. Okay, so now what does that mean? Well, I'm not going to tell you what that means because I gave you a video talking about that, right? And we know that the T wave has ventricular repolarization. The S wave is ventricular contraction. So if we have any issues with this physiology here, we need to stop that test, right? So if we have a 2 millimeter, and I'm not going to expect you guys to say, oh, well, it's 1.5 millimeter. I just want you to know if there's changes in these visual lines. Let's say this one is slightly lower. Then that means we need to stop this test, right? This type of ramp test here. Or let's say, let me clean this up, get rid of that. Let's say the T wave inversion occurs. So let's say the T wave is inverted this way, right? That would be another reason to stop this test. And again, I'm not going to test you on any information about looking at this type of graph or this type of image here. I'm just telling you that if there's any changes in the S or the T wave, you need to know what those changes represents. And you should know what that represents after watching my previous video telling you how this ECG is measured and how the leads read that. So you should be very familiar with that right now. So let me zoom in on this a little more and let's look at this test. So now that we are looking at this test, we can see the important features or characteristics of it. So the first thing to notice is, again, the speed. The speed is 2 miles per hour after the first 2 minutes. So for the first 2 minutes, they're at 1 mile per hour. So imagine that on a treadmill, how low intensity that is. And then once we get at the 2 minute mark, we increase the speed from 1 to 2 miles per hour. And then at the 4 minute mark, we start to increase the grade, but notice that the speed stays the same. So on this test, we have something very, very low intensity, and it is a submaximal test, and it gives us the information that we need, again, focusing on heart rate and VO2. Now, it's a very different approach. So for different populations, essentially, we have different ramp protocols, and we kind of saw that with all these different options that we have here. So when we are conducting this submax test, these tests kind of strive to maintain a steady state of heart rate. Okay, we know that when we do a test like this, as I showed you, because it's highly trained individuals, every time this intensity increases, we're going to have a spike in heart rate. If we do another test like this one here, the Wilson test, you can see here that only the speed changes every few minutes here, and it doesn't get above 3 miles per hour. And then once we get to the 12-minute mark, we're going to have these increases in grade. So here we would imagine that for the most part, we would have a fairly steady heart rate. That heart rate would maintain kind of a normal steady heart rate. And then maybe here, oops, that's the wrong thing. That's not a pen that I would use to draw. What just happened? That's what I wanted there. So we would have a fairly, oh my goodness, just technology. You're just killing me. There we go. We would have a fairly steady heart rate, and we can just say that the heart rate's going to look like this. And then when we get to this kind of incline portion, we would have a slight spike in heart rate, right? So we want to maintain steady heart rates on submax tests, and that makes sense because if we look here, we're looking at ECGs, we're looking at heart rate, and one of the things we're doing is we're canceling the test if we see any dysrhythmia, or if we see any changes in ST, or if we see any changes in the T segment. So that is kind of making us really stay critically aware of what the heart is doing for that test. So that test wants to basically maintain a steady heart rate. And we're going to basically manipulate some variables where O2 consumption and heart rate are going to increase slightly. And these are those variables, right? The changes in grade. And basically what this is telling us is that there's this relationship between heart rate, oxygen consumption, and workload, right? And you should know that from your previous test or your previous course in 456A. So now these treadmill submax tests, which I just showed you here, this will allow us to basically provide estimations of their functional cardiorespiratory capacity because it's submax. So we're going to have to get some estimations here and assume that a linear relationship exists between workload and heart rate. All right. So in the submax test, we're assuming that. In a maximal test, we're measuring that. We're measuring what that looks like. And again, another test here. Let's look at this guy here for cardiac patients. We can see here that this one starts at a 10% grade, and then the speed increases every 3 minutes or so. So we're going to start at a kind of an intense grade here, walk for 15 minutes, and then when we get to the 15-minute mark, we'll increase speed here to 4 miles per hour. So it's still under a run. So there's different tests to evaluate different things, and that's the big takeaway message here that I want you to kind of leave with. So if you look at these tests compared to a test like this, you can look by the variables, and in this case, the variable is the increase in grade. That heart rate is going to be way more unsteady here than it would be in a case like this, or in a case like this. So keep that in mind. Okay, so now let's move from the protocol on the treadmill to the cycle protocol. And you can see here we have a cycle ergometer. Generally, we use a bike like this or something like this. Again, this is from that same textbook. I did upload this for you. You can see that there is some information in here that you can read about. That's why I added these pages. Here's some different protocols that you can look at here. It'd probably be very advantageous for you to understand that. But again, it's all in the same pages. Now, we have a couple different types of protocols. We have, for a cycle test, we have a ramp protocol, which basically has this kind of continuous increasing in intensity. And then we have stage protocols where you can see here, there's actually some breaks in between. So here we can see from 0 to 5 minutes, there's work. And then from 5 minutes to 15 minutes, so there's a 10-minute break here, and then we work again for 5 minutes, and then there's a 10-minute break here, and then we work again for 5 minutes. So there's two types of approach to this, right? So we have a continuous and a staged protocol. Now, when we're talking about the cycle ergometer submax test, this as well can be used to predict VO2. So we're talking about a population where we have to predict the VO2 and the level of fitness because we want to maintain steady heart rate as close as we can. We don't want to tax the heart too much, especially somebody that is dealing with AFib. So these tests, again, are either continuous or discontinuous, okay? And it's based upon what we're trying to obtain. And we're measuring that relationship between heart rate and oxygen uptake and this linear function, this linear capacity with work rate. So again, just to make sure you guys are tracking here, we have intensity, we have heart rate, and we have VO2 or oxygen consumption that is linear with workload, right? So if we look at this test here, we would have an increase in heart rate, an increase in oxygen consumption, and then with this break, we would have a decrease in heart rate and a decrease in oxygen consumption. And then here we would have an increase, and then here a decrease and a decrease. So we know that there's this relationship with all three of those variables, and they're all centering around workload. So again, we're going to use a submax test to predict or to get our best estimation of what their aerobic capacity is via a submax test. And again, we're going to use these sort of parameters here to measure, and these endpoints to tell us that it's too much work. All right. So when we're dealing with the cycle, we can do a ramp protocol at 10 to 15 watts. These here, let's see. These here are pretty heavy wattage, right? So this one starts at 50 watts. So this one is already, we can't use this. And again, this is for normal risk individuals, normal risk individuals, normal risk individuals. So these 4 examples here that they give us in the textbook are for normal individuals who are not dealing with any experiences of heart complications. So none of these would work. But again, I'm just kind of showing you what these differences look like on the cycle ergometer. So Or we can do a stage protocol between 20 and 30 watts with 3-minute stages, okay? So that would be a modified version of this here. We could see at this stage protocol, this one goes 50 minutes, so we would cut that down substantially to 20 to 30 minutes, as you can see here, and the watts would be substantially lower, right? So we're doing a submax version of this. Now, some other things that we would want to kind of keep in mind and assess is this, where is it right here? Where did I see it? Here it is. The angina scale, and what that looks like is this here. And basically what that means is very similar to the RPE. You guys should all know what RPE is by this point. This angina scale is going to have to do with how much chest pain you have during exercise. So you can see there's a scale here between 0 and 10. I've actually seen some different variations of this, but it goes from 0 being I have no chest pain to mild, moderate, moderate to severe, and severe. And we have different levels of chest pain. So just like when you guys do a VO2 max test, we have several things that we're monitoring at the same time. And in this case, we have to bring in this angina scale with an RPE as well. The last thing we'd kind of be looking at is, while we're measuring gas exchange, is we'd be looking at blood pressure, and we want to make sure that blood pressure is not exceeding these margins here. So we have this whole kind of series of things that we want to look at. And we want to make sure that once some of these things start to change, we want to stop the test. And again, some of these things, they can go from, if we look back at this test here, right? This one here is for cardiac and high risk, but it's a 27-minute test. So some of these things that we're looking for, right? Some of these endpoint indicators that we're looking at here, these things might not even pop their heads out until we get further into this stage here, right? So we're constantly assessing it to make sure that we're staying within these healthy margins so that we can continue the test to get the best information we can to measure how their body performs under stress. So that kind of covers most of what I found is relevant and important. Now, one of the things that we would do, because we can't do these, sorry, that's the wrong test. Let me move down here to the cycle ergometer test. We can't do any of these tests here with at-risk populations. So if you move down here, it kind of explains what this test protocol is, and then it gets into, later in this, it gets into a basically modified test. So I'm going to provide you guys with a video of one of the modified tests that we use all the time, which is the Astran cycle test. And it's a modified test that I have a video for and some PowerPoint slides on that will give you lots of information. So that's kind of where I'm going to stop this, and you guys can kind of pick up with that video. I believe that video, if I look at my schedule, it's going to be uploaded next week. So I just wanted to get you guys that information for assessment. Now, we've talked a lot about assessment. We talked a lot about the parameters that we want to stay in when we're assessing. That's all right here. And the next thing I want to show you is once we have an assessment and we've considered all of these parameters, how do we get an exercise program going? And what I'm going to do is show you this picture here that I also included in your module. And this is for exercise programming. And this picture, again, comes from the 2nd and 3rd edition, but it's not in the 4th edition. So it tells us once we have this information and we've assessed, here's how we can start prescribing. So there's modes, there's goals, there's intensity, frequency, and duration, and there's time to obtain the goal. And this basically means 3 months, 2 to 3 months, 2 to 4 months. So is it safe to train individuals with AFib aerobically? Yes, it is. Is it safe to train them strength-wise? Yes, it is, but ACSM recommends we use weight machines rather than free weights. Do we train flexibility? Absolutely. So what are our goals with aerobic training? It's to increase our VO2 peak, right? So our better delivery and utilization of oxygen. That's important when you're dealing with changes in heart function and contractility, because if you have fluctuations in contractility and heart function, you're going to have fluctuations in oxygen delivery. So through aerobic training, we can hopefully kind of normalize some of that. And we want to also increase daily activities or activities of daily living, right? That's what that kind of stands for. So we want to make sure that people that have this condition can mow their lawn and do their laundry and clean the house and do some gardening, where they're not going to tax their energy systems out or challenge the heart even more while doing these tasks. Here's the intensities that we want to work in. So we want to work in an RPE of 11 to 16. We want to work at a VO2 max of 50 to 80% of their peak VO2 or their heart rate reserve. You should know what their heart rate reserve is from your 456A class. How many times should they work out a week? 3 to 7. Well, that's a pretty big gap. Even 50 to 80% is a pretty big gap. So what this is saying is that you have to understand your client. You have to understand where they are when you assess them. And based upon that assessment, if they do this assessment and their VO2 is, let's say they scored a 27, which is a terrible VO2 score, well, then we're going to start here at the lower end of intensity with aerobic training. And we might want to start at the lower end of days per week, and we might want to start at the lower end of how many minutes per session, where if they have been living with AFib for a long time and still exercising and they have a VO2 score of 36, which is pretty good for somebody with AFib, well, then we can kind of operate in these higher intensities here, 80% of the VO2 or 80% of their heart rate reserve, and maybe 5 days a week and maybe 40 minutes a day. So that's what we can do with aerobic training. With strength training, we want to use weight machines and just increase overall body strength. We want to do high reps, low resistance. And that's because high resistant training has been shown to impact diastolic blood pressure. So, anytime we have squeezing of the muscles for long periods of time and then releasing of those muscles, well, we know those muscles are squeezing around the vascular system, and it could change or interrupt or have a negative effect on blood pressure in people who are living with AFib. So again, increased strength, high reps, low resistance, 3 days a week, and then flexibility training. We want to increase flexibility, reduce risk of injury 3 to 5 days a week. So here is a snapshot of how we would train these people and assess these people. And as we move further into each lecture, I'm going to keep bringing these things up, keep talking about this, and we're going to add different assessment types or different assessment methodologies. So you guys see that I have this here, but I really didn't talk about it much. Well, that's because we went on a lot here, and I want you to digest that. And then we'll start talking about some of these endurance tests and these flexibility tests. We will get to them. But right now for AFib, I just want you to understand how we would test, right? We have these modified submaximal tests where we want to keep the heart rate as steady as possible. We don't want to tax the heart, because with people with AFib, we know that we have fibrillations, or we have dysrhythmic contractions because of AFib complications. So we want to try to maintain heart rate as long as we can. That's a steady heart rate as long as we can. That's the biggest takeaway from this, okay? And the other biggest takeaway from this is, okay, well, we know who we're dealing with. We know what kind of tests we'll do. We know what we would use to measure. You guys should know this now based upon the lecture I just given you on how this system works. You know what these things are. So really focus on what happens if there's this change in the ST segment or a change in the T wave. That's really important for you to understand. And then you know that we can kind of train these people within these parameters. So if I were to ask you on an exam, hey guys, if you're training somebody with AFib, what intensity would you train them at aerobically, and why? So one of the things you should be able to do at this point, let me see if I still have it up here. Let me pull it out really quick, is you should be able to say, oh, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. He gave us this. It talks about the disease, the pathology, the signs and symptoms, exercise testing, what we want to look for, and exercise prescription. You have all the answers right there in front of you. So that is basically all I wanted to share with you guys for the moment. And then I'm going to try to find you a video that shows some of these different tests. I'm going to search the internet hard for these videos and see if I can get you something that would show a modified test that is not an aspirin test, because that one I have, and that one's easily found. So that's it for now, guys. I will be in touch very soon. I hope you guys are learning a bunch.